Hello, my name is Ilya Grin, and for the EDL 605, today we'll be presenting the journal article review based on the article titled Culturally Sustaining Pedagogy, a Needed Change in STEM's Terminology and Practice, written by Dr. Django Paris published in 2012 in the Educational Researcher. Dr. Django Paris is an associate professor of language and literacy in the Department of Teacher Education at Michigan State University. He received his PhD in education from Stanford University, and he has published in many academic journals, including the Harvard Educational Review and Educational Researcher. Dr. Paris's article was inspired by the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings. She is also the author of 2009 book The Dream Keepers. But the article that inspired Dr. Paris is titled Toward a Theory of Culturally Relevant Pedagogy, and it was published in 1995. Dr. Ladson-Billings worked on her research with successful teachers of African American students, also giving a coherent theoretical statement for research done in the 1970s and the 1980s. According to the author, by the year 1995, research all the way from the 1970s and through the 1990s reached a critical mass in educational research at the intersection of literacy, culture, and language, with African American, Latino, Indigenous American, Asian American, and Pacific Islander American students. In the mid-1990s, amassed evidence for resource pedagogies in working with students of color, marginalized by systematic inequalities based on race, ethnicity, and language, resulted in what Ball and Paris called the golden age of resource pedagogy research. According to Dr. Paris, this research sought to provide pedagogical and curricular interventions and innovations that would move teaching and learning ever further from the deficit approaches that echoed across the decades. Prior to and during the 1960s and 1970s, deficit approaches looked at home culture and cultural ways of being, as well as language and literacies of students and communities of color, as deficiencies that had to be overcome in learning the dominant language, literacy, and cultural ways of schooling. The dominant language, literacy, and cultural practices demanded by school fell in line with white and middle-class norms. And position languages and literacies that fell outside of those norms as less than and unworthy of a place in US schools and society. The goal of deficit approaches was to eradicate the linguistic, literate, and cultural practices many students of color brought from their home and communities, and to replace them with what were viewed as superior practices. The examples of deficit approaches are the federal Indian schools. Those Indian schools were forcibly stripping native languages and cultures from indigenous American students and communities. In the 1960s and the 1970s, home cultures and communities of poor students of color were bankrupt of any language and cultural practices of value in schools and society. Looking at the difference approaches, which were a little bit of an improvement from the deficit approaches, difference approaches viewed languages, literacies, and cultural ways of being of students and communities of color as equal to, but different from, the ways demanded and legitimated in school teaching and learning. The goal of difference approaches was to bridge toward the dominant language and culture with little attention to maintaining the heritage and community practices of students and families. All the previous research resulted in the resource pedagogies from the 1990s through today. Resource pedagogies built from the seminal pedagogical and curricular work resisting deficit thinking of the 1970s and the 1980s. Resource pedagogies reposition the linguistic, cultural, and literate practices of poor communities, particularly poor communities of color, as resources to honor, explore, and extend in accessing dominant American English language and literacy skills and other white, middle-class, dominant cultural norms of acting and being that are demanded in schools. Resource pedagogies found their most lasting theoretical framework in the work of Moll and Gonzalez, published in 1994, with their formulation of funds of knowledge. Moll and Gonzalez use the term funds of knowledge to refer to historically accumulated and culturally developed bodies of knowledge and skills essential for household or individual functioning and well-being. Building on their work with classroom teachers as ethnographic researchers in the homes and communities of Mexican American and Mexicano students in Arizona, Moll and Gonzalez provide evidence that teachers and students can successfully use this knowledge and skills in formal classroom learning. Another framework that must be mentioned is known as the third space. This concept is developed by Gutierrez and her collaborators. In her 2008 research of students from migrant farm worker families in Los Angeles, Gutierrez describes curriculum and its pedagogy that are grounded in the historical and current particulars of students' everyday lives, while at the same time oriented toward an imagined possible future. In this way, she argues that teaching should not be just about making connections between often separate areas of life such as school, community, and home, but rather bringing together the activities and practices of those communities and school in a forward-looking, what they call third space. These two frameworks, funds of knowledge and third space, and now decades of pedagogical work built through them, have looked to join the home and the community practices, histories, and activities of students and communities of color with dominant school ones in meaningful ways that do not devalue either in the process of school learning and access. It is important to recognize that access to the opportunities that were delivered through the proficiency in the dominant academic and social ways with language and other cultural practices were also goals of the deficit and difference approaches. However, deficit approaches were looking to eradicate the heritage and community forms of communication, and difference approaches were ignoring pretty much heritage and community forms of communication and language and knowledge, while solely focusing their attention on legitimated school ways. As I mentioned earlier, Paris and Ball called the mid-1990s the golden age of resource pedagogy research, and one of the reasons was the Latson Billings landmark article published in 1995 that formulated culturally relevant pedagogy. Paris, like countless researchers and teachers, has been inspired by the idea of making teaching and learning relevant and responsive to the languages, literacies, and cultural practices of students across of categories of difference and inequality. However, recently Paris began questioning if these terms are descriptive of teaching and research and if they go far enough in their orientation to ensure the valuing and maintenance of the increasingly multi-ethnic and multilingual Lutz and Billings called for culturally relevant pedagogy that would produce students who can achieve academically, produce students who demonstrate cultural competence, develop students who can both understand and critique the existing social order. Paris notes that by cultural competence, Letts and Billings was speaking of supporting students in maintaining their community and heritage ways with language and other cultural practices in the process of gaining access to dominant ones. So looking at the previous research, Dr. Paris was trying to answer the questions such as if the research and practice being produced under the umbrella of cultural relevance and responsiveness was indeed ensuring maintenance of the languages and cultures of African American, Latino, Indigenous American, Asian American, Pacific Islander American, and other long-standing and newcomer communities in our classrooms. If a cultural stance toward and critical action against unequal power relations is resulting from such research and practice, and if the very terms relevant and responsive are descriptive of what we are after in teaching and learning in pluralistic society. So Dr. Paris comes to a conclusion that although Letts and Billings in her 1995 work was creating the ground for maintenance and cultural critique, the term and stance of relevance and responsiveness does little to support the goal. Paris argues that it is possible to be relevant to something without ensuring the continuing presence in students' repertoires of practice. He is also looking to create a term that would offer teachers a way of conceptualizing and simply naming the need to meaningfully value and maintain the practice of their students in the process of extending the students' repertoires of practice to include dominant language, literacies, and other cultural practices. And that is why he offers the term culturally sustaining pedagogy as an alternative that embodies some of the best past and present research and practice in the resource pedagogy tradition, and as a term that supports the value of multi-ethnic and multilingual present and future. So the term culturally sustaining, according to Paris, requires that pedagogies be more than responsive of or relevant to the cultural experiences and practices of young people, that they support young people in sustaining the cultural and linguistic competence of their communities while offering access to dominant cultural competence. That way, according to Paris, the goal of culturally sustaining pedagogy is supporting multilingualism and multiculturalism in practice and perspective for students and teachers. Culturally sustaining pedagogy seeks to perpetuate and foster linguistic, literate, and cultural pluralism as part of the democratic project of schooling. Exploring the need for culturally sustaining pedagogies, Dr. Paris is asking, what is the purpose of schooling in a pluralistic society? And he is looking at the signs of persistence of deficit perspectives policies and pedagogies, such as English-only policies, decontextualized language and literacy programs in poor communities of color, and explicit bans on studying of histories, literatures, and struggles of particular ethnic group that he saw in Arizona. Such a climate has created the need for equally explicit resistance that embrace cultural pluralism and cultural equality. It is brutally clear. In the end, Dr. Paris argues that without such resistance, students will continue the age-old American saga of being asked to lose their heritage and community ways with language, literacy, and culture in order to achieve in the US schools. And this saga of linguistic and cultural loss has had and continues to have devastating effects for the access and achievement of students and communities of color in the US public schools. He continues that research and the pedagogical curricular and teacher learning innovations is interested not in relevance or responsiveness, but in sustaining and extending the richness of our pluralist society. Such richness, Paris says, includes all of the languages, literacies, and cultural ways of being that our students and communities embody, noting that he's talking about both marginalized and dominant. And this is it for the culturally sustaining pedagogy. Thank you for reviewing with me the article by Dr. Paris, published in 2012. If you have any questions about this presentation, feel free to contact me using my school email, and have a good day.